Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for the time. There's a lot I want to tick through. Broadly speaking, first off, infrastructure problems are in the face of Americans every single day, and President Biden wants this package to be passed by this summer. If that goal is reached, when and how will Americans feel the impact?
Well, the good news is Americans are already feeling the impact of the president's leadership on things like the American Rescue Plan, which had an infrastructure element, mostly just to make sure that we brought back some of our transit agencies from the brink of disaster. About $30 billion are now beginning to flow through the Federal Transit Administration to support local communities that were facing layoffs and route cuts. But that's just to get us out of the woods. Now's our chance to begin doing what we've known really for our whole lifetime is needed in America, which is a major generational investment in infrastructure. We know that there are projects ready to go, hundreds of billions of dollars, in fact, that are already in the pipeline if we just had the funding. This is our chance to actually line up that funding and get to work.
And what is the backup plan if this initial effort proves to be too ambitious? Is everything included in this package negotiable with Republicans?
Well, what the president announces tomorrow will be his vision and his plan. Of course, what happens next is the legislative process that naturally has give and take. We're open to hearing a lot of ideas, and we'll see where the process takes us in terms of exactly how the legislative pieces move. But the important thing is we've got to act. We've got to act big, and the president's going to lay out a clear vision on exactly what that could look like.
A big part of this plan is to combat climate change. Is it realistic for Americans to believe that investing in climate change will translate to job creation? Because I know back home in Indiana, across the country, a lot of people associate climate change reacting to it with losing jobs.
Yeah, it's time to break the old false choice of climate versus jobs. The truth is the only way we can create jobs that last and work into the future is to do it in a way that also helps fight the climate challenge. And by the way, that's happening more and more. These aren't just complicated futuristic jobs. I'm talking about jobs like union building trades, insulators, glaziers involved in retrofitting buildings, and in the transportation side, things like the increasing development of electric vehicles made right here in the United States, often by union workers. So yes, this is fundamentally a jobs vision with climate benefits, and the more we understand that, the better we'll be able to move as a country. You know, industry is already seeing this and headed in that direction. Other countries are already seeing this. It's far past time for America to do the same.
What measure or what metric will you be using to measure success when it comes to fighting climate change?
Well, we know that the science is giving us some very stark deadlines. We've got to be a carbon neutral economy by the middle of this century. We have, and this is pushing it, just doing it by 2050 in terms of heading off the worst disastrous outcomes. And that might sound like a far off date, but there are things we've got to do right now in the early 2020s. If we don't act, we will fail to meet those targets, and we'll pay a very real, very physical price for that. I think preventing the destruction of lives and property and jobs due to climate change is one of our biggest responsibilities. And again, the good news is we can do that in a way that also creates millions of good-paying, lasting, often union jobs.
Is there a place to have a conversation about incentivizing remote work to help fight climate change?
Well, one thing we've all learned, I think, with the pandemic is that the way that many Americans work will never be the same. Now, one thing we've seen is the possibilities of remote work for those who are fortunate enough to be able to work that way. Another thing we're seeing, though, is that there's no substitute in many cases for the work that we do face-to-face and in a room with one another. The truth is, we don't yet know what exactly the return to work will look like. But I think whatever we arrive at as our next normal, it's not going to look like 2019. And yes, that could have some climate benefits. We should have policies that recognize that.
I have some questions specific to some of our stations across the country. For our viewers in Kentucky and Ohio, the Brent Spence Bridge, I'm sure something you're familiar with, has kind of long been a headache. It's in need of this $2.6 billion makeover. I've spoken with local officials there who say we do need the federal government to commit to large investments to help this project and others, but they've also said that in the recent coronavirus relief bills, money has come, but there have been restrictions attached to it in order in terms of how fast the money needs to be spent and on what it can be spent on. What's the plan moving forward to make sure these bigger projects not only get the funding they need, but the time they need in order to make them happen?
Well, this is exactly why we need to be prepared to make a major generational investment in improving things like our bridges and our roads. You know, American engineers are warning the public policy community about what will happen if we don't do this. The Brent Spence Bridge is just one very important example that unfortunately is repeated in many places around the country, and a glaring illustration of why we need to invest with a lot more ambition in our nation's infrastructure.
How important is it that the U.S. Postal Service fully electrify its fleet of vehicles? And are you concerned that this new contract with Oshkosh Defense isn't committing to doing that right now?
Well, the Postal Service is an enormous user, of course, of vehicles and transportation assets. And while it's separate from what my department works on, we're watching closely because we think it's so important for there to be real market leadership from the use of public dollars when it comes to encouraging electrification. We're even looking at how our own fleet of what the Department of Transportation owns and operates can lead by example. And I think every part of the U.S. government ought to do that. By the way, the sooner we do that, the sooner we're building up a U.S. electric vehicle industry. Right now, China's got a bigger EV market than the U.S. does. It ought to be the other way around, and we could make that happen with the right policy choices.
Democrats in Congress who have alleged that this Postal Service contract was maybe done and made, the deal was made with inappropriate political influence. Is that a concern that you share from what you know about it?
I don't know as much about the details of the contract. What I will say is that everything we do has to be guided by the highest public policy priorities and include provisions to make sure that it's also responsible for our climate future. And whether we're talking about vehicles or anything else that the U.S. buys, we've got to be living up to that very high standard.
Our viewers in New York, they want to know about the status of the Gateway Tunnel project, if you see it moving forward soon.
So this is critically important and yet another example of why we need to think big and bold when it comes to infrastructure funding in this country. Look, the Gateway and the tunnels that are involved there are not just important for the area in and around New York, New Jersey. It's really important for the whole country because of how much of our economy is involved in that Northeast corridor. We're talking about tunnels that are in some cases 100+ years old and that have taken a beating over the years. This is why we need to do more on the processing and permitting side. We're working to make sure that we're keeping things prompt and efficient. On the funding side, we've got some decisions to make as a country. And again, it's one more example of why there's a sense of urgency behind the president's forthcoming vision on American infrastructure.
And then a question from our viewers in California. They want to know what role the federal government can play in addressing the lack of public transit, specifically in Southern California.
Well, one of the things that I think is really striking in Southern California is that even in an area we think of as very car-centric, there is a lot of public interest in having better transportation resources and transit. Look at the passage of Measure M in Los Angeles under Mayor Garcetti's leadership. Look at the extraordinary work that the Los Angeles Metro is doing. And whether we're talking about LA specifically or California more generally, there is a lot of opportunity when we do that, when we give Americans those great options to be able to get around, make sure they're affordable. What we're doing is we're actually unlocking economic opportunity. We're giving more people a chance at the American dream, and you shouldn't absolutely have to own a car to have a piece of the American dream.
Two more quick questions for you. You mentioned the $30 billion in funding that the American Rescue Plan provided for public transportation. I ride the Metro every day into work. It's been very, very empty throughout the pandemic. Will $30 billion be enough in the long run, whether it's for bigger systems like the Metro or the Transpo bus line back in South Bend?
Well, the real focus of these dollars in the American Rescue Plan is to bring these agencies back from the brink, whether we're talking about an agency like Transpo, the bus service in my South Bend hometown, or something like WMATA, the Metro agency here in Washington. There has been a crushing blow to revenue because of what happened to ridership. We were looking at the threat of layoffs, the threat of service being cut, and the rescue plan gets us out of the woods. Now, getting out of the woods is not the same thing as a permanent long-term vision. That's why the president's announcement is going to be, I think, so important and so welcome for those who care about transportation resources for the future.
And then lastly for you, based on your time in office here in Washington so far, what would you say is the biggest disconnect between the federal government and local officials like you used to be when it specifically comes to infrastructure?
Well, my experience as a local official was that you had to start with the idea of solving a problem and then worry about party politics afterwards. Here in Washington, sometimes it's the other way around. Just look at the rescue plan that had tons of support at the local level from mayors in the Republican and Democratic Party, Americans regardless of party. There was a really strong level of support, and yet that wasn't reflected here in Washington. I think infrastructure is the one case where we got a really good shot at having that be different. It's already popular among the American people, and now we just got to make sure that's actually reflected on Capitol Hill too.
Anything else you want to add?
You know, I'm so energized to be in this job at a time like this. I think moments like this only come along maybe once in a lifetime for our country to really make a big decision about the future of our infrastructure. It happened under Lincoln when they decided to complete the Transcontinental Railroad. It happened under Eisenhower with the creation of the interstate highway system. And it could happen right now in our lifetime if we make this choice this year.
Mr. Secretary, thanks so much. It's great to talk with you.
Same here. Great being with you.